Thank you. I get this set up. Everybody hear me? Awesome. So hurricanes in Nova Scotia, primarily focusing on one hurricane, 1757 hurricane, that nearly rewrote world history. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of climate context, because hurricanes are very topical these days. A little bit about North Atlantic tropical cyclones, so just to provide a little bit of background information. And what's unique about the 1757 hurricane is that it occurred during a cold climate period known as the Little Ice Age. And so it's important to talk a little bit about that. And during the Little Ice Age, the political issues of the time included the 7 Years' War, which is why we have any information about this particular storm at all, which I've referred to as the Lewisburg storm, but it's a storm that struck Cape Breton September 25th, 1757. And then you'll see a sign that says break, because there's a natural break between sort of the historical piece and the and getting more into the science of trying to understand, so how do we determine how strong the storm was based on historical information, and combine that with comparison to modern analogs to determine whether or not this was a more powerful storm than we've seen in modern times. And then we'll look at the what if certain decisions that had not been made at the time were made, and what the implications might have been for history as we know it today. Well, this is the climate context. You can't get a geologist up here without showing you some squiggly lines. This refers to the last 17,000 years. So the end of what we know as the Ice Age was called the Pleistocene, that began 2.65 million years ago and ended with the start of the Holocene. So you can see that break up on the top of this graph. And that was 11,700 years ago or so. But that pinkish color is sort of the temperature trends. And what you'll see is, for comparison, the average temperature trend for the year 2000. And you'll see, so we're really at the very, very tip. Now, it's fairly faint on this screen. Can you see the bluish lines? Okay, good. These are important because they refer to cold climate periods. So the Younger Dryas, which was at the end of the Pleistocene, was a period where it just dropped right off, became very, very cold for about a millennium or so. And then it warmed up rapidly. And then we see, if you look up at the top, you see where it says Little Ice Age, where there's that little blue line, and that represents a colder climate period. From a geological standpoint, what's interesting about these periods is that the sedimentary deposits that they leave indicate that they were stormy periods. So when we hear an awful lot about tropical cyclones and warming influencing the formation of tropical cyclones, we're not really looking at some of the past. Like, it makes us wonder, well, if we're expecting stormier periods when it's warm, why are we seeing these storm deposits when it's colder? So one of the things that we're challenged with is how we compare these different periods of time. So where we look at weather data, we look at, so basically from the instrumental period, where we have satellites and computers, and so we can capture weather information in real time and store it and manipulate it and understand it better. It's not so easily done during the Little Ice Age. So what we do have, though, is the ability to look at recorded data, so information that was descriptions primarily that were recorded at the time. And I'll get into this. This is important when we're talking about the age of sail and sailing ships, where they're recording information on an hourly basis every day. And that information needed to sail the ships is weather information. Okay, so we'll revisit that. But it's very challenging then to compare. It's like apples and oranges. And then we have, of course, geological data where we can, if I could take a sediment core out at Lord Sound Beach, and I can pick out the storm layers, and we can interpret something about those weather systems. But we don't have the same controls over the timing that we have when we're talking about modern instrumental data. This is just intended just to cover off, how these tropical cyclones form. So we begin off the coast of West Africa, sort of hot, dry air interacting with the low pressure trough. Moisture just helps it evolve into a system that tracks along a zone called the main development area, main development region, between 10 and 20 degrees north latitude, so just north of the equator. And as it proceeds, as warm temperatures, warm sea surface temperatures serve as fuel. And you can end up with these cyclones or these gyres that will intensify under the right conditions and tend to track into either through the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, or they can track up into the eastern seaboard of North America and pay us a visit. So that's sort of the general trend. What happens in the mid latitudes, which is basically taken from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, northwards. What tends to happen is that they lose their tropical energy, and so they become post-tropical. And so there's some implications for this, as we'll look at later on. But that's typically what we experience here. So I'm going to reach back to 2022. Fiona was probably most recent visitor, and Fiona's interesting because it follows almost the same path, the same track as the 1715-7 storm, and it occurred on the exact same day. So that was lucky from a scientific standpoint, I suppose. But so the storm entered Canadian waters as a Category 3 hurricane, and that's a major hurricane. So the hurricanes are rated based on their intensity, and the intensity is determined by wind speed. So there's certain thresholds of wind speed, and you could go from Category 1 to 2, 3, 4, and 5. Getting more and more intense, more powerful, more destructive. So this storm Fiona began as a Category 3, so a major hurricane. And it's if you look at the path, we cross 40 degrees north latitude. You're coming into Canadian waters, and you can see the wind speeds that are along the left. That they start to decrease. So it's starting to lose some of its punch. But as it gets closer and closer to land. And if you look at the inset map, so I took this inset map was from NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the US, National Hurricane Center. And it shows the sea surface temperatures for the days preceding the storm. And you can see all the red, nice, warm, tropical-looking colors. Those are tropical temperatures. So that's the Gulf Stream. So it tracks north. And the start of the mid-latitudes is as Cape Hatteras, where you can see it's deflected seaward. This current flows north, and it's deflected seaward. But that's where it meets the south-flowing cold water Labrador Current. It originates in the Davis Strait of the Canadian Arctic. And so you see a little bit of change, a little bit of mixing. And that coincides with where this transition is taking place. I'm probably the wrong way. Wrong button. All right, so the value of historic storms. Well, what's useful about this, the cold climate period, is that we can extend some of our models back in time to a time where we have a little different climate reality. And it just helps us understand systems better, allows us to build our knowledge. And storms are really important geologically. They're discrete events. We can pick them out in the geological record, and because they're agents of geological change. So something strikes, rearranges your beach, there's a record of that. And sometimes, we might have to use geophysical methods or take a sediment core, whatever. But we can piece together, reconstruct the impact of that system. And we can look at the relative frequency, like how often do these things actually strike and where. And then finally, they cause shipwrecks, especially in the age of sail. So it's kind of sort of morbid and all that, but from a wreck diver, it is what it is. Okay. So that's what enticed me to look at the wreck of HMS Tribune. So Tribune, this is a scene of La Tribune when it was a French frigate in the French Navy during the French Revolutionary Wars, captured by HMS Unicorn. So I was always interested in wrecks from the age of sail, from that period for whatever reason. But I wanted to understand more about the site I'm diving, to understand its significance. And so I did the research and sort of learned more and more about it. But this is the story. This is the wreck associated with the story of the heroic boy from Herring Cove, 13-year-old Joe Cracker. So he was living in Herring Cove, and the Tribune had been captured, as you can see, by the British Royal Navy, brought into the Royal Navy and served as HMS Tribune. But as it was entering Halifax Harbor, it ended up running aground at Thrum Cap, just by McNabb's Island. And while they were trying to free the ship, a big nor'easter blew up. And when they freed the ship, it was driven over to the Halifax side and wrecked in Herring Cove, where most of the crew perished. But for the actions of this little 13-year-old boy who braved the elements, rowed his boat out into the storm, and shamed the adults into getting the rest of the survivors who were just clinging to the rigging. But I was able to determine his name was John Davis Jr. And put an identity to that boy. But anyway, that's I think how it began. It also dragged us into Halifax Harbor, as you can see, during the most beautiful time of the year. We try not to get run over by those big things in the distance you can see in this right-hand slide. But it's been doing that for quite a long time. We avoid the summer months because there's a lot of recreational traffic. And we work with harbor master and other authorities to get permission to dive in the harbor, but it's sort of mid-channel, deepest, strongest, darkest, not for everybody. But this is some of the stuff just examples. So Royal Navy China, mess plates, various items. There'd be that white dish in the front is from Canard Liner, the Aquitania. There's a little meat paste Proutware pot with the charge of the Late Brigade on it from the Crimean War. So yeah, you never know what's down there. It tells a lot about our history and heritage. Well, some of the pieces, not like the others. These pieces are just an example of the pieces that have been found. They're a little older. These go back to long before Halifax was founded. So this top shard, that's Portuguese olive jar from the mid to late 1500s. The Spanish amphora from mid 1600s, and then there's a little oil jug on the right as example. And so we're kind of puzzled by these things. So to get identification, so one of the guys in the dive group had a business that took him to Florida on a regular basis, and he used to talk to the people diving the wreck of the Etosha, a Spanish galleon lost in the Florida Keys. And they said, yeah, no, we find stuff looks just like this. So we work with a lady. Her name's Tanya Casimiro. So I've listed one of her papers up at the top, and she was willing to look at these pieces and put dates and provenance to them. And she's done a lot of work in understanding sort of the really early trade in the North Atlantic by working with archaeological sites. And I shared this with Katie Couture-Robbins, who was chief archaeologist for the province. And she said it was really interesting because she was on a dig and they were finding very similar things, same age, same types of materials. So and she asked, well, do you think it's a shipwreck? But it spans too long a period of time. And there's no evidence of a shipwreck there. So as much as you might think about, diving the harbor, the harbor bottom in the Narrows is gravel. It's rock. And so that's why we were able to find things. But they're all located, all these pieces are located as north of McDonald Bridge, about mid-channel, but pretty much all in the same place. So I thought it was an anchorage. So why would there be an anchorage right there? If you look at the layout of the harbor, that's the colorful piece. That's survey using multi-beam or use sound to determine the depth to the seabed and then piece it together to get an overall map of water depths. But it tells us a lot about the sedimentary processes going on in the harbor as well. So if you look at where all these arrows point, suggests there's an anchorage there. And why would there be an anchorage there? If you look at the orientation of Halifax on the peninsula, you can see that if you had southeast winds associated with nor'easters or with hurricanes, what do so much damage to blow straight down the harbor, but you're just out of that. And then because it's a cyclone, as soon as the winds turn around, you've got a fair wind to push you out of the harbor and send you back home where you want to be. So that's what we suspect. There's that there's a reason for these pieces being there. It's also interested in there was a lot of work being done on the Goodwin Sands in the English Channel. And there are 13 Royal Navy wrecks from the Great Storm of 1703, which they believe was equivalent to a Category 2 hurricane, which is unprecedented. I mean, this is 1703 is the coldest part of the Little Ice Age, which is already a cold period. So that's very curious and very, very destructive. So we're back to looking at multi-beam again. So there's the panel, not the inset one, but there are two panels here. One's taken from 2018, one's from 2020. And what you're looking at is sort of the depth to the seabed. So the light colors are so the tops of these big sand waves. And you can see quite a difference between the 2018 and 2020. So the sand waves move, just like sands in the desert, but they're underwater. And they're exposing these historic wrecks and forcing the authorities to take some action to map them, to study them, to collect artifacts, conserve artifacts, and what have you. And and there's the inset is the sort of the wreck of HMS Northumberland, which is one that they've been working on. Well, one of the wrecks associated with the Goodwin Sands was the Invincible. And I had reached out to the guy named John Broomhead, who's a fellow diver, and he and his friend, a fisherman named Arthur Mack, discovered these fragments in the seabed and identified the wreck and moved to have it conserved as to have it protected as a protected site. And I was interested in the types of things that they were finding. So, and I was also interested in a ship of the same period, HMS Tilbury, which was lost in Cape Breton during a big storm. And as it turns out, the Invincible was damaged in that same storm. So they sent me that book, and then the team had done all this work, autographed it all. So I was thrilled to get that. And so there was an interesting piece about this storm, and so I wanted to learn more about it. So what's unique about this is that it indicated that there's more than just like a single ship or a couple of ships. This was a big deal. This was a full naval blockade of Fortress Louisbourg during the 7 Years' War. The capture of Louisbourg followed in 1758, Quebec 1759, but the intent was for all of that to happen the year before, and it didn't happen because of the storm. And the more I researched, the more I worked with original source material, and began to say there's something more to this. This is not just sort of a minor blow. And it seemed to be more intense than things we've seen, certainly in modern days. And then, as I mentioned before, Little Ice Age storminess records the intensity and frequency of these storms. So the question is, can we characterize the intensity of this particular storm by quantifying real-time observations? So how do we go about doing that? How do we get some numbers out of this? And then, if it is a more powerful storm, how do we explain that with the climatology of the North Atlantic? Well, let's start with the Little Ice Age. I'm sure it was not as much fun as is depicted in this painting. This is, you notice I work with some kind of period artwork and what have you to try to bring us back a little bit. This is called a frost fair in the Thames River, 1677. And the Thames River during the Little Ice Age had frozen a number of times, and frozen so completely that people would go out and spend time out there and I guess have some fun while they're doing it. The Little Ice Age is thought to have been triggered by explosive volcanism with the emissions cooling the earth, and the advance of ice in the Arctic serving to reflect heat energy, and so prolonging sort of a sort of reinforcing mechanism. But overall, the northern hemisphere was 2 degrees Celsius cooler than today on a mean annual basis. And sea surface temperatures were 1 to 3 degrees Celsius cooler than today. And you remember because sea surface temperatures are the fuel for hurricane intensity. So if this is cooler, how are we explaining this? So, and as a little bit of a test to this idea, the eruption of Tambora in 1815 saw global temperatures drop by as much as 0.7 degrees Celsius. It had an impact on the Battle of Waterloo, the torrential rains that impacted the charge of Napoleon's cuirassiers against Duke of Wellington's line. It was drawn by the inability to move troops around had a huge impact on the battle. The following year was the year without summer, and it includes here. I mean, we sometimes have years without summer, but this is this was a real one, more intense because the ground froze every month of the year. There's hard frost in the ground, snow fell at higher elevations every month of the year. It impacted grain prices and a whole lot of things. It really impacted, it just turns out that 1815 was the bulk of the African-American refugees from the War of 1812 who given their liberty and lands in Nova Scotia. So you arrive and you're given a 10-acre plot of land, and which here is at the best of times is challenging. So imagine you can't even get a shovel in the ground. So it created some hardship for sure. Sorry? I think it's the ash in the atmosphere affects the sunlight. I believe so. Yeah, and I'll be tapping a local volcanologist for the answer for that. But I believe it's the fine ash in the atmosphere. But it does seem to have a consistent impact, like with a lot of eruptions. And here we're going back to the North Atlantic being very stormy, and there are a couple of examples. I mean, there are just hundreds and hundreds of storms, but there's certain events that have sort of made it into the history books. So the Spanish Armada. 1588, 15,000 lost. So this is where Elizabeth of, sorry? Okay. I thought somebody had a question. And Elizabeth I rallied her army at Tilbury in England, and that's where she gave her famous speech. So I may be just a woman, but I have the heart of a king, and an English king at that. And so that did it. And her captains, Francis Drake and John Hawkins and others kept the galleons from coming close to shore. They had fire ships and what have you. And so they kept them out where they were susceptible to the bad weather, and the weather declined. It forced the ships to sail all the way up around the UK. And there are galleon wrecks. I've seen one of them in Scotland, and they're just everywhere. And one of them, the one that I saw, had these big wheels. They didn't know what they were, and they were able to recover them and They interpreted them as once they restored them, they were wheels for the siege guns intended for London, but they never made it. Then I mentioned the Great Storm of 1703, killed 8,000. Then one surprisingly few Canadians know about is the deadliest hurricane in Canadian history is the Newfoundland hurricane of 1775. It killed 4,000. And that's believed to be sort of in the U.S. it's called the Independence hurricane. It was just about a week before this when they believe they're maybe connected somehow. All right. Well, so I think we have our weather systems down. Well, let's look at the political systems. 7 Years' War was largely fought between Britain and its allies and France and its allies. And you can see from this, so Britain in the blue and France and its allies in green. And you can see the pink shows areas of conflict. So it's truly a world war. Yes?
Before you go on the Spanish and that, apparently that was also the time when they defeated the Spanish and then applied the British. When we changed the American in that same time.
Yeah.
Opinion shows that you go into this in a lot more detail.
Yeah.
So the political consequences are much bigger than just the storm.
Oh no! The storm was an agent for the destruction of their fleet. But yeah, that's a great point. It's yeah, these things tend to have a big impact, and that's actually going to, that whole idea is part of what I'll get to toward the end. Yeah. So 7 Years' War. We're going to focus more on activities here. Now, because I'm going to be focusing on focusing on the storm and an event during that storm, I necessarily have to just kind of cover off the some basics. So part of the lay of the land is we have, I guess, the first permanent settlement settled by Champlain at Port Royal in 1605, and he establishes an alliance with the Mi'kmaq, part of the Wabanaki Confederacy. 1608, he goes on to found Quebec, except he didn't receive the same welcome. And so the Iroquois peoples and different tribes, of course, but they reached out to Britain for support in terms of tactics and weapons and so what have you. The War of the Spanish Succession, the main thing about this is that they began to construct Fortress Louisbourg, so a powerful French fortification and naval base in Cape Breton Island to guard the entrance to the St. Lawrence Seaway, so the approaches to Quebec. So you can see how it would be a very valuable military naval asset. The War of the Austrian Succession saw the fall of Louisbourg, and it was captured by a force of British and American colonial militia, and in 1745. And so the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle came in 1748, during which time they gave Louisbourg back to France. And you can imagine they weren't, certainly the people who were involved in its capture were not that thrilled. So Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, founding of Halifax, 1749. There's no accident. Halifax was founded the year after to present a counter to a resurgent Fortress Louisbourg.
So the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was between Britain and between Britain and France. So we weren't involved at all in that, I guess.
Oh, so we as in
whatever Canada was back then.
Oh yeah, it was. Well, it was always they were fighting over what it was going to be. So yeah, determining who's going to have control, France or England. So for their bid, they founded Halifax, so they would have the ability to support Royal Navy vessels a little closer to closer to Louisbourg and closer to New France. And sure enough, the need for that came up with the 7 Years' War. Began in skirmishes in the Ohio Valley, but ultimately it led to the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, then the fall of Quebec, and then Montreal, leading to the Treaty of Paris. But the main outcome is that it saw France lose a huge amount of its colonial possessions. So it was created a lot of animosity, certainly among the Europeans, because Britain became disproportionately powerful. And it meant that France was predestined to have a willingness or interest in supporting the secession of the American colonies later on, which we'll talk about later. Well, all of this was supposed to happen in 1757, and so the grand plan of William Pitt, Prime Minister of Great Britain, was that you capture Louisbourg and then you capture Quebec, ideally in the same year, because you don't want to go for Quebec and have a very powerful French fortress and staging point at your rear. So you capture Louisbourg and then Quebec. So he gave directions to Vice Admiral Francis Holborn, who you can see in the top, and Lord Loudon, Commander-in-Chief of the British Forces in North America, to command the army. So they'd have a combined force to make short work of Louisbourg. And so they threw a few ships together. This is the British fleet. And so when I was originally thinking there was one vessel involved, I clearly was wrong. But you can see the names of the ships, and some of them have sort of numbers of guns, sometimes like on the right, so a sloop or a bomb catch, vessels that would have a mortar that would lob explosive shells up and over defensive walls. But most of them were ships of the line, which meant you could line up your ships and sail next to the enemy at close range and unleash heavy naval guns. Definitely not for the faint of heart. So 19 battleships out of a total of 34 warships, crewed by 12,000 sailors, and they were supported by 12,000 troops who were sent to Halifax from New York and from Cork, Ireland. So as it would happen, things political are the same in the past as they are in the present. So William Pitt had a non-confidence vote in Parliament, and so everything stopped. All the preparations for going to sea, building the forces to attack Louisbourg came to a halt temporarily while he was scrambling to pull together coalition government. And during that time, French spies decided that it was Louisbourg that they were going after. That's what they were preparing for. And so they put together a force that would go to Louisbourg and reinforce it before the British arrived. And they did exactly that with 18 battleships, many of which were more powerful than their British counterparts, 12,000 sailors. They included 4,000 troops from France to bolster the 3,200 person Louisbourg garrison and the irregular force of 500 Mi'kmaq and Acadian troops. So so they were waiting. So in all their glory, this is what these ships look like. They're sailing ships. They have no other means of propulsion but the wind and the expertise of their crews and their commander. And So in general, to give a little bit of terminology, so for the front of the ship, the bow, the first mast is the foremast, then the largest mast is the main mast, and then the mizzen mast. And they're typically rated according to the number of guns or the cannons that they carried on board. And they're typically, aligned along the sides of the ship. So they would line up side by side and fire at each other at really close range. But you get a sense like these were not large ships compared to what we know today, but in their time, they were pretty formidable. And so this ship would be hard pressed to fit under the clearance of the harbor bridges. That's how tall they would be. So I think the clearance for the harbor bridge is about 55 meters. So we're up there. So they're and the masts, and this is important. How the masts were made. You'll see on the main mast, the lower section it's a meter across, and these were individual trees. So later on, they learned to scarf together different pieces of wood so that they could achieve the same thing. But they would have the king's foresters travel all over creation, from the colonies to a lot came from the Baltic, to find trees big enough and perfect enough so that they would be strong enough to serve as masts and some of the larger spars in the Royal Navy. And you get a sense there too of the foretopsail, which is canvas, weighs 800 pounds dry weight. Now imagine that, trying to deal with that, standing on a spar, rolling in a heavy sea, driving rain. This thing is heavy and the winds are blowing. So you definitely need to know your stuff. I think that hat is gone. One thing that's important about understanding the Ice Age, and it's really significant, is that on average it was cooler, but it was also a time of greater temperature variability. And so that's recognized by a lot of top climatologists. So it's interesting. I was interested in finding out that year there was a heat wave in the UK, and it expanded across Europe. The mean high temperature in London, July 16th to 26th, was 41.3 degrees Celsius. And it's recognized even in Halifax Harbor. Officers who were part of the British fleet recognized that on the 20th, it was as hot as any of the tropical posts they'd been in. And it's interesting, that temperature record held until 2003. And wasn't beaten by much. And it's not to say this is driving the storm, but those temperatures existed. There's hard evidence for the systems that are creating the heat energy that power these storms. They existed in 1757. This very storm is first seen off Florida, but there are no dates given. September 22nd, off Cape Breton, the ships record prevailing westerly shift to easterly gales. The next day, this hurricane is still 1,300 kilometers from Nova Scotia, where those winds have already shifted, and it damages the British frigate HMS Winchelsea off of North Carolina. Then the 23rd and 24th, storm passes offshore New England. And then 25th, it strikes Nova Scotia. And it's interesting. Benjamin Franklin is a really interesting character because he's recording all this stuff, and he's actually recognizing, he's a naturalist. So he's recognizing there's something going on here. Like he says, hurricanes, and he's referring to this one, are produced by currents of cold winds rushing from the north along the Atlantic coast and mingling with the warm winds produced by the Gulf Stream, which is really interesting. So keep that in mind for later when we're looking at at our storm. So the inset map, you can see sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 in the study area, that red block is the big map. And so 1 is Florida, 2, North Carolina, 3 is New England, and 4, Nova Scotia. And this represents, this map area just shows sort of most of Nova Scotia. And all of these dates simply refer to the location of the British fleet at the time. So what happened was when they were all ready to go, and they're going to go up and they're going to show the French what's what, and they captured a small schooner that had dispatches on board. It said, by the way, the French have sent all these warships in there, and a significant body of troops. So Lord Loudon recognized immediately this means we're going to be into a siege over the winter. So a siege in the winter during the Little Ice Age, probably no fun. And they'd be in their tents outside the walls while they could hear the harpsichord music and fiddle playing and Louisburg transshipped Jamaican rum or rum from the Caribbean, I should say, and it have nice wines, and so their siege experience is going to be quite a lot different than Lord Loudon. So Lord Loudon decided he's going to spend Christmas in his mansion in New York, and they took the army and left. And so they sent a few troops to Fort Cumberland on the Nova Scotia-New Brunswick border, but otherwise they're gone. They're out of the picture. So Francis Holborn decides, well, maybe I can still convince the French to come out, get the fleet to come out and do battle. So he's going to blockade them and try to make their life miserable. So these dates simply represent the arrows next to the dates, which are the distance traveled and the direction of the fleet on that date. And so you can see they're kind of going back and forth until they come to that big oval. And that's when they were struck by the hurricane. Well, the French, and this is Louisburg Harbor. And as you can see a few features here. The town is down to the lower left. You can see the fortress wall, and I put a sort of a red oval there just to mark the waterfront. Near the waterfront is Battery de la Grave, which we'll revisit later. And then the line of French battleships, the moorings were tended to be up in that area, and then Royal Battery to the north, which would cover the entrance to the harbor. And then there's Louisburg Light. And Louisburg Light proved to be really important, something I didn't expect. But I was looking through the ship's logs, and none of the latitude and longitude numbers made any sense. And so latitude was okay. And I realized they didn't figure out longitude then. So what did they do? Well, they worked with a local landmark, and the landmark would be taken as your zero meridian. And so I went changed the numbers that I had on the ship's logs and made that adjustment to take Louisburg Light as my meridian, and the positions all made sense. So that was kind of a cool thing. But so anyway, this is sort of where the French fleet is set up shop. And you can see this is historic image, same image, 1730s map of Louisburg, but it shows the sort of the coverage of the gun batteries. So if somebody's coming in, sailing into the harbor. But it's funny that nobody ever took north as straight up on a map. That later became a convention. So you see all these historic maps, and you have to turn them around to try to make any sense of them. So, 22nd, we start seeing southeasterly gales, and we know nothing good comes out of the southeast, and when it comes to weather. So, and at least along this coast. Um, under the fleet under Admiral Holborn, the British ships secure their guns. So for the term loose cannon, well, you don't want 2.5 to 3 tons of iron flying around a rolling ship's deck. That'd be no fun at all. And the top gallant masts. So the very topmost parts of these masts, they would telescope. So you bring them down because they would be damaged. And so everything's secured. Well, the French, it's interesting, the French records show the exact same thing going on. They're responding to these, the change in the winds. The ships are at their moorings. So what they do is they set 4 2-ton stock anchors. They dig the flukes into the seabed and tension the anchor cables to keep the ships from moving. They're set at the bow of every ship. Fort Cumberland, as I mentioned, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick border, Lieutenant John Knox, who kept a journal of his venture to from Ireland and then in Halifax and then there, he records September 23rd, violent rain. September 24th to 26th. I never saw anything like it. And then what's really interesting, strikes me, is 27th, 28th, windy, showery, and very cold, which is interesting. And then same journal notes that we're really getting winter weather about 2 months in advance of what we see today. So the following sections are excerpts from ship's logs. So I worked with all original material, dispatches and what have you, all from both Great Britain and or from UK and from France. 7 p.m. on the 25th, the excessive hard gales with hard squalls, and it's getting stronger. And squalls have a real meaning, a meteorological meaning, kind of like gusts, but sustained. So I looked at a range of definitions, and that typically are 40 to 60 kilometers per hour above threshold winds, so sustained threshold winds. And that's the World Meteorological Organization and Environment Climate Change Canada. By 12 a.m., they're seeing torrential rains and the waves are becoming huge, great sea. By 2 a.m., they all are saying independently, right? It's blowing a hurricane. They're describing waves like mountains. And there are records from people who survived this who wrote in local British papers. They're talking about they had been at 50 years at sea, had never seen anything like it. Sails are being stripped off of the ships. They're just ripped to pieces. HMS Devonshire, HMS Sunderland battleships describe the waves so big they're going straight over top of them. It's just sweeping the ships. HMS Cruiser had the wind tear its mizzenmast completely off the ship. They lost 3 crew. They had to jettison its guns just to stay afloat. So it's raining so hard now, they have the ship's pumps going and they still can't keep the holds clear. They end up with 8 to 10 feet of water in the holds. They're worried of actually having the ship sink. Battleships Grafton and the Invincible have the 30-foot, 3-ton rudders ripped off. The Invincible's rudder was saved by, it had preventer chains on it. So it lost the use of the rudder, but it didn't lose the rudder. And that's just from trying to stay under control. Battleships Sunderland and HMS Captain, their 2-foot diameter 4 topmasts are ripped off and they're held in place with shrouds. So you have 2-inch hemp shrouds supporting these things, in addition just the material strength. So, and they're carried off into the night. I mean, there's still sailors clinging to these things and they just gone. They didn't fall to the deck. They were carried away. The ships were then blown onto their sides. Invincible is on its side and has to jettison 10 naval guns, 40 tons of iron just to right the ship. But as it comes upright, the wind is so strong, it snaps the mainmast. That's a meter in diameter. It snaps it in half. It tears down. The other two masts and pulls the ship over on its side. So you can imagine what that would be like. There's no light, pitch black, driving rain, massive waves. The ship's filling with water. This is a battleship with 800 crew. And you're frantically slashing with cutlasses, with axes, just to free up the wreckage so you can right the ship. And luckily they did. Other ships were similarly dismasted. And one smaller vessel, HMS Farragut, with a crew of 120, disappeared, just completely swallowed by the sea. No record or sign of it. Well, in the luxury of Fortress Louisbourg, probably not so much. The Batterie de la Grave guards are standing their post and find the water's up so high, just the water's just coming up and up and up and up. So when they set their knees, they decide, okay, this is not good. We're out of here. So they abandon their post. 4 to 6 a.m., the 70-gun Dauphin Royal snaps its 4 anchor cables. So those 4 anchors that were set just tears free. It's thrown into the 80-gun Lieutenant and into the Lavadecki's frigate. And all 3 are thrown on land at Royal Battery, where they describe with considerable violence. So I guess it was there's no picnic. They describe the stone ramparts at Fortress Louisbourg are torn down by the waves. So those are pretty robust defensive walls. They're actually ripped out by the force of the waves. Seawater reaches lakes 10 kilometers inland. They describe half the town of Louisbourg being submerged by the ocean. 25 merchant ships, 50 schooners, 80 smaller vessels are thrown bodily on land and left high and what they describe as high and dry, like completely, later on there's these ships up where they shouldn't be. And the British were sure they were finished. They were being driven against what they describe as a lee shore. So the wind's pushing you, you have no control, you're trying to set an anchor. Some were able to, some were not. And they figured that was it. So then it was equally thought to be divine providence that was so close, but at 11 o'clock in the morning, the winds came around, completely blowing off the land. And so they were heavily damaged, but they survived with a couple of exceptions. Records from both France and England agree that if the storm had continued in the same quarter for 1 hour longer, they would have lost both fleets. That's over 20,000 sailors. One ship that was lost was HMS Tilbury. That's the one that I was interested in diving. 60 guns, 400 crew, and stranded between a line of offshore breakers and shore near the fishing village of Saint Esprit, south of Louisbourg. And the ship breaks up and it strands sailors on the stern wreckage. And they're actually rescued by a party of Mi'kmaq, a war party. And they were, half dead from what they've just been through. And they were thinking, this is it. Except the records say the work chief told them they had nothing to worry about because they had been brought to them by the storm. Of course, he reminded them that don't try anything because if you had come to make war on us, then none of you would be spared. And okay, so it was challenging. The survivors from the Tilbury were picked up eventually by troops from Louisbourg and brought back. They couldn't go by ship because the waves were still very, very large in the following day or two. but ultimately, the Hermione sailed from Louisburg on November 2nd with 40 Tilbury prisoners. Well, they're about to become prisoners of war in France, and they get rescued by the British frigate HMS Unicorn, and they engage in a 5-hour sea battle. Can you imagine? And this is a painting of of that actual contest. And you imagine being that close. Now, most of those guns are 12-pounders. They fire a 12-pound ball of iron. How many people are familiar with Halifax Citadel and the noon gun? Mark. Okay, if you hear that up close, it's pretty impressive, right? You hear it through the downtown core. That's 1 pound of black powder. To fire a shot is 7 pounds. And the noon gun is fired once. So imagine this between two ships at close range. So they were certainly made of tougher stuff. And I think this is where break comes. So that's the historical piece. And then when we come back after the break, we'll look at some more of the details, understanding the storm. Okay, thanks. Time to pay for that free coffee. We're going to get into more of the science. So it's about deriving weather data from historical records. So I worked with original materials. They're not in digital format. They're in the UK and in France. I worked with so original log books, and everything's written in longhand, and so it's. So anyway, it was an exercise. And there are multiple log books. They don't all survive. I mean, this is a very long time. 1757 wasn't yesterday. What's important about them is that it's data recorded in real time using a consistent terminology. And so hour by hour, you have somebody recording what's going on. So wind, sea state, all these things that are important to understand what the weather's doing. So I worked with 10 ship's logs obtained from National Archives in the UK, and then 5 French ship's logs from Archives Nationales de France. On top of that, there's also all kinds of other stuff. Admiralty list books to figure out like what ships were where at any given time. So making sure you have true information, and letters and dispatches. Letters were really informative, certainly from ship's captains to the admiral, talking about why they're beating a hasty retreat back to England for repairs. And memoirs, John Knox's journal I mentioned before, but James Johnson was an interesting character. He was a Scottish, he was a Scottish officer serving with France. So he had, with the French, he had, during the Jacobite Rebellion, he had fought against the English, and so he then went to France, joined the French military, and was posted at Louisburg. And so he kept records of the experience of of being there, as well as being in the storm. So one of the metrics we look at is probably the least important one is wave height. And the ships don't actually record wave height, but they record what's happening to the ship, and the ship as a reference. And you have the scale of the ship, and you have drawings of various ships. So you can determine a pretty good estimate of what significant wave height was, 40 to 60 feet, and maximum wave height. There's a record of a sailor being swept out of the foreyard by a wave. So it's significant, but it's consistent with what we see of large storms today. More important is wind speed and direction. The challenge is logbooks contain terminology, and the terminology is what would become the Beaufort scale. So excessive hurd gale, extreme hurd gale. So there was some research done, an individual looked at trying to understand how do we make these records consistent and interpret So if we can interpret what they mean in terms of Beaufort scale, we can apply a wind speed. And so there are a lot of synonyms, and you start to get a sense of so what the actual numbers are. And the same thing with the direction. They navigated using points of the compass. So they say the magnetic compass, north is 0, so it corresponds to azimuths. And so you see all these terms like west by north or northwest by west, but you also have northwest by half west. And but you can turn that into a number, right? So that's what's useful about it. And in this study, because there's such a narrow time frame and such a restricted geographic area, you don't have to worry about adjusting for declination or anything like that. Just straight numbers. And then you have the kind of the overall sense of the logs. So there are 3 watches, 8 hours each on board ship. And the main thrust of this is that you have prevailing westerlies, then you have the southeasterlies associated with the storm, and then the 25th, and you have the cyclone passes, and you're back to westerlies, and then the prevailing westerlies again. So it provides that broader context between September 16th and 29th. So what you do is you get all this information, all these independent, they're independent weather recording stations, each one of these ships. They have their own sense of location, they're recording, they're triangulating the positions in, they can see this headland, that headland, this is where I am. They can see that ship, they can see this ship, and they're all doing the same thing. So you get a really good sense of the position of these ships at given times. And the long black line is the displacement or the distance traveled by the Invincible between the September 24th, and then it found itself south of Petit de Graaf on the 26th. And one thing I should mention about comparing, so data captured at sea and data captured on land at the time, the sea day began at noon, not at midnight. And the reason for that is because in order to fix your position, you would go at midday and use your sextant to determine the angle of the sun to figure out your latitude. So you have to counter that as well, to make sure you're comparing all the same things. Well, when you have wind speed and wind direction, you have a vector, you have velocity, and you can plot velocities. And when you take these clusters of ships and you find that their overall wind measurements are consistent, so A is where the Invincible was, among a couple of others. B, C is the up around Saint-Esprit. D is the French fleet at Louisbourg. And you fix those positions. And you take those wind directions and you draw normal to them, 90 degrees, and that shows you where the eye of the storm is. And you do it again the next day, and the storm is somewhere, the eye of the storm is moved up to just off of Sydney. And so if you have 2 points, you can determine how far the storm has moved in that time and get translation rate. Pretty cool, huh? But our question is, was this in fact a more powerful storm than anything we've seen in modern times? And so to do that, it has to exceed category 3, at least the threshold speed of 178 kilometers per hour. And another thing that's important, another metric you can use is surge. Surge is directly proportional to wind speed. And so we'd be looking at something like, what's that, 2.7 or so meters. And we were talking about surge. So this is a diagram showing the roll surge. So you have mean sea level, sort of say a 2-foot normal high tide, and then what's that, 15-foot storm surge. So you end up, if the storm strikes at high tide, you end up with 17-foot storm tide. So that basically there's nowhere else for the water to go. If the storm struck at low tide, then that tidal zone takes up all that water. But if it strikes at high tide, well, you're in for a lot of trouble, especially if you add in the wave impacts on top of that. This gives an example. This is from Hurricane Juan. I don't know whether it's telling of my kind of background. My daughter was born during Hurricane Juan. Who knew, right? But this is kind of interesting because you can see the tidal cycle. That's I think the green one, and then you see the actual water level, and then you see in red the storm surge, and so the impact that has on top of the tide to kind of push those water levels up, and that's what adds to flooding and flood risk. But I was really really important is understanding what's the wind speed that breaks a tree. And this does have some relevance because if you remember, what are ships' masts made of? And they're individual trees in 1757. So luckily, I didn't have to figure that out myself. There was an engineering team that published a paper on this, not in terms of applying it to ships' masts, but in terms of just figuring out what it is. And what was interesting was that it's consistent, irrespective of species. There's a little added factor for the size of the tree. And the thing to remember too is that this will give us a minimum because they are pre-selecting these trees for ships' masts. They're going around the world to find masts that really experienced shipwrights and people have to work with these and turn them into masts. They're looking for something that's going to withstand several decades of service at sea in all conditions. So here we are with the squiggly lines again. Now this is a plot of, elapsed time from starting from the 23rd, and it's in 2-hour increments on the sort of the bottom axis. And I plotted sort of just to get a sense of the wind directions. So we have sort of the ships farthest south where the Invincible is, all the way up to the ships that are farthest to the north, which is where the French fleet is at D. And then you take all these numbers you get and you plot. So the Beaufort numbers first, right up to hurricane speed. And then you get to where the logs say we're in a hurricane. Well, that's threshold of 118 kilometers per hour. But how do you determine sort of what intensity of hurricane? When you look at the logs and you see all the entries, all the damage on the ships, so breaking of masts, tearing sails to pieces, all that stuff, that's pushing us up and to a much higher level of intensity. And if I take say the Invincible and correct for the fact there's a ship in motion under these winds, then we end up with a wind speed of 171 kilometers per hour, sustained winds. But then we also have squalls. And what's interesting is the squalls correspond to a lot of this damage. And squalls are 40 to 60 kilometers per hour above the sustained winds. So this gives us a range of 211 to 231 kilometers per hour, which is a category 4. So we can actually test this independently. There's another piece I want to mention. We also, and it's related to that next test, which is surge. Okay, so we're close to shore. We have information about surge heights. So we know the tidal range of Louisburg Harbor, and we know the timing of when I think it was Lieutenant began to float the tide at 11 o'clock in the morning. And so you start back calculating and you can determine what the tidal cycle was and then look at the sort of how does it correspond to the increasing winds when you're making landfall? And so what it reveals is that we have a bit of a storm tide. Well, let's go check this out in person. This is a Fortress Louisbourg, courtesy of Parks Canada, National Historic Site. Battery de la Grave, where the sailors had, or sorry, the soldiers had to abandon their post because the water was up to their knees at that point. Archaeologists have determined that since the middle of the 18th century, sea levels have come up by 0.85 meters. This is also supported by research by the Geological Survey of Canada. So we have to accommodate for that. So anything that we're seeing impacting the fortress, you add on that factor, the sea levels have risen. So they had to, at the time, overcome that distance to create that flooding. So we've got a few spots to look at. So Battery de la Grave today is 2 meters above sea level. The lowest lying streets in Louisbourg town, 5 meters and 7 meters above sea level, and everything else is at a little higher elevation. And so if we look at the early storm, and we're 2 meters above sea level, we want to accommodate the fact water came up over people's knees, so we have a distance for that. And we're mid tide. We end up with about 3.4 meters or 11.15 feet of surge. And then peak storm, and this is with the tide rising. So we're not exactly kind of like Hurricane 1. We're not exactly right on the peak of the tide. It's probably just as well. And then the peak storm and looking at the town of Louisbourg, we end up with mid-tide surge of about 5.9 to 7.9 meters, or about 19 to 26 feet. And there's another way we could test this. We're going out to find the Tilbury. Let's go for a dive. This is the location. The thing about the Tilbury was that it was known, as people mistakenly thought it was a treasure wreck. So under treasure trove licenses, people had discovered this, but they had the wrong war when it served as a pay ship. So it was here in 1745. That money's been long spent. And so in this war, it was not a treasure ship or a pay ship. So carrying a pay for the army. So, but anyway, this is a location. I had to recreate the seabed, and I've left things in feet because I'm going to compare the depth to the displacement of the hull of the Tilbury, and explain why in a minute. But you can see where the breakers are, and then the early shoreline accommodating changes sea level. So we pulled a crew together. You may or may not recognize Tony Sampson, dragged him from Oak Island up on the upper left. And interesting spot. We were out there in the fog and I said, "What's that?" And it's the wave crest. It's like, I think we need to get out of here. So even in calm days, it's pretty rugged. So we worked with a marine magnetometer and found 6-pounder British naval guns on the seabed, and they're in 10 feet of water, which was 7 feet in 757. But the marine charts are based on different datum than Google Earth. So we have to accommodate for that. And I mentioned about having to rediscover the site because nobody would share where the wreck was. So we found it ourselves. But so it's interesting at this site, the Mid-tide water depth, 1757 at the Tilbury site is 9.5 feet. Well, for the Tilbury to be afloat in that water, it needs another 9 feet, right? So the ship's draft was 18.1 feet. It was seen by other ships to be afloat at that time in that location. So we accommodate that. We adjust for the change in the datum so we can compare Lewisburg and the Tilbury site, and we end up with same level of surge as at Lewisburg. Let's compare it to some other events that we've had. This one is an especially fun one. I worked offshore during this, so we had jack-up rigs that actually bounced off the seabed with 77-foot waves. And the air gap between sea level and the base of the hull was 70 feet. So, yeah. But I got a hat that says First Hurricane 2000. So, yeah, collector's item. The surge is 4.6 feet. So it was extra tropical. It's considered a super bomb, powerful storm. Then Hurricane Juan, Category 2 hurricane, truly tropical, 4.9 feet. Fiona was more powerful, post-tropical, about 16-foot maximum surge. And then so we have our storm, Lewisburg storm, and we're sort of definitely in the running there. So all the pieces hold together for Category 4 at peak. And this is hurricane season. What's interesting is with hurricane season, typically on average between using data from 1944 to 2020, tropical storms and hurricanes were plotted, and the height of hurricane season is September 10th. So I had not a lot to do apparently, as I worked with historical records, 569 tropical storms and hurricanes, use the exact same process and metrics. What's interesting is that over that totally separate data set, September 10th is still the height of hurricane season, even going back to 1700. So it tells us like the timing of heat transfer from the equator northward is consistent. Another pieces are important. Yeah, atmospheric circulation reconstruction is important. So the North Atlantic Oscillation basically says there's, if it's positive, storms don't want to go into the North Atlantic, they'll go into the Caribbean and into the Gulf of Mexico. And so if it's negative, they'll track up into the eastern seaboard of North America. And then there's the El Nino Southern Oscillation Index, which is kind of a pressure regime in the Pacific. And that has implications for what happens in the North Atlantic. So if we have La Nina year where you don't, oops. Can you hear me now? Yeah, I'll just hold this for now. You end up with conditions that create wind shear that break up these storms so they don't form in the North Atlantic. So what's interesting, this is a reconstruction by other researchers. 1757, we have strong conditions driving very favorable for big storm to form in the North Atlantic and track up the eastern seaboard. Now this is a plot just to show overall 1700 to 1880, see the frequency of storms, but frequency of storms is directly proportional to sea surface temperatures. And what's interesting in sort of the 3 decades surrounding the hurricane of 1757, there's an increasing tendency for storm strikes to hit at more and more southerly latitudes. And yet what's interesting is that the outliers for the north are still consistent, going up past 40 degrees north latitude. So it's a reminder that even though you can have these trends, you can still have an individual storm that will come up and make itself known. So this is a percentage of tropical cyclones passing 30 degrees north on the top, and it's sort of a general trend. But what's interesting is you look at the ones making it into Canadian waters, and the Little Ice Age is a period where we suddenly see a dramatic warming of the Labrador Current, 1850, and so it's interesting that when we plot the percentage of tropical cyclones passing over it, that we see a dramatic increase. So this is the climatology. This is put together by Hart and Evans. They did an analysis of just absolutely huge study. I think they studied for storms for more than a century, and they're actually climatologists. But what happens is basically these blocks represent sort of the key months in hurricane season. So June, July, August, September, October, November. And what happens when you pass the summer solstice, you start, you can see the summer's on the wane, and you start increases. So the prevailing westers start to gradually drop to lower latitudes, and you start seeing continental cooling. Well, continents cool a lot faster than water. Water retains heat. And so that's why we've had, that consistent, what we saw before, consistent timing of hurricane season. So when hurricanes are generated, that's consistent through time. But what's different in the Little Ice Age is that you have conditions that were in November accelerated. So we end up with those cooler temperatures in September. And so, and it's like a catalyst for release of tropical energy. So that's what's driving this extratropical transition. So the Lewisburg storm was a post-tropical system that unleashed its energy because of this, creating this. But it unleashed its energy dramatically. And it's that temperature differential that drives the intensity of the winds that we measure as hurricane intensity. Some modern implications, if we're projecting warmer sea surface temperatures, more powerful parent storms, there's a chance that the same process would take place, but you're beginning with the difference is that what's consistent today would be sort of the seasonal change, but you're adding that temperature differential by having warmer air masses, your warmer air masses as part of the storm system. And so there's a chance that we may see more powerful storms, not because more powerful storms come up in their own right, but because as they transition, they can end up creating a lot more impact. So this is the what if. Remember, I said what if. Both sides, the French and British, agreed that just 5 or 6 battleships could have captured the entire British fleet. The water had washed away the gunpowder. They were in no shape to maneuver the ships. The rigging was all wrecked. There was some illness in the French fleet at Lewisburg, but it was not debilitating at that time. That came about, a month later when they made it back to France. But at this point, they still had tons of extra sailors or people they could have used, and certainly had enough ships at their disposal, ready to go to sea. They also had 4,000 French infantry sitting around wondering what to do. So they could certainly make use of those. So you could take as much as 36 battleships and deploy against Halifax. And Halifax's defenses are based on the Royal Navy being there. right? So the Halifax Defense Complex was in its infancy at that point, but it really depends on not having a really powerful fleet coming at you. And Halifax only, I mean, if you've basically captured all the British ships, Lord Loudon's in New York, so nobody's coming to you. The French knew the harbor. Duke d'Anville came in here 1746. So they had all the elements. This is diagram of the town of Halifax at the time. You see the defense is mostly, they're protecting against the land attack. George's Island in 1757 had 7 32-pounders, which are pretty robust, comparable to what they have on the ships, 9 24-pounders, but they're all focused on one end of the island. So what do? You may choose to land your 4,000 troops and wait until you bring your ships in. And once you're behind George's Island, you could make short work of any defenses of Halifax. Halifax was pretty rudimentary defenses at that time, and they improved them with later time. But certainly Halifax could have been taken quite easily. And I mentioned before, France's losses to Britain in the 7 Years' War made Great Britain disproportionately powerful. The American colonies lacked representation in Parliament. They resented being taxed for the war because it was hugely expensive. So you hear, taxation without representation. By seizing Halifax, you have control over the sea lanes between America and England. France's heavy losses led it to be willing to listen to, and I believe it was a contingent that initially went over to England to petition for, representation in Parliament. And then they went over to France, and they were willing to provide gunpowder, weapons, training to counter the British, strong British force. And France supplied these, and Spain supplied primarily artillery. And then you see increasing role directly of French troops and interference by the French Navy. The Battle of Yorktown prevented the relief of Charles Cornwallis and led to surrender to George Washington. So at that point, but if you don't have any cause for France to be involved, if they're secure in a powerful new France, none of this stuff happens. Britain would, you have Halifax, everything north is French. Britain reinforces the eastern seaboard, the colonies, so they've got a very powerful presence there now. And you probably don't have the siege of insurrection, and there's no War of Independence. So, kind of interesting. What if? And so, with that, I'd like to say thank you. The bulk of the climate stuff was published now 2 years, I think, in a climate journal.